Okay, I think we're back. My sincerest apologies about dropping out there. I don't know what happened. OBS decided to crap the bed. So, yes, this is Philosophy Roulette 248, where I read and review philosophy papers. If Cinesemiotics is back, which I don't know if they will be, but let's see if we get anyone back. I was gonna grab this paper here and see if it was available. It is not available. That's where I read and review philosophy papers live on the air, but unfortunately this one is not available from Ratio. Let's see if it is. Oh no, Ratio is not. I was thinking, what is Ratio? Ratio is not a short article. Is it? Yeah, it is short. Let's see. Nothing. PDF. Let's see if I have access. I doubt it. Yeah, nah. That's unfortunate. Yeah, so let's see. What else is going on here? Oh, so many things to choose from. Alright, so we've got a bunch of these things. They're short, and hopefully, this one's got 138 downloads. I wonder if that just means it's there. So, hopefully Cinesemiotics will be back. Maybe if Cinesemiotics comes back, we'll read their request. Yeah, this is available. So on the possibility of wholesale moral error, how bad can we mess up? That's a good question. I like that question. Let's download this paper. Let's take a look. It's 12 pages, but it's, oh dear, there's formulas and whatnot. It's kind of a small font, but hey, 12 pages is usually doable. So, let's do this, and we'll see what happens, and then we'll play it by ear after that. Now, if you are watching live on Twitch, you can always grab the paper by typing !paper in the box, or you can, if it's later on YouTube, the link is going to be below the description, in the description to there. So, let's see. Cool. So this is on the possibility of wholesale moral error in what journal? We're in Ratio, and yeah, this is by Farbod Akhlaghi, and I apologize for how I say everyone's names. That's not like Bob or Joe, because those are the only ones I actually can say without messing up. But anyway, let's get going. Let's see what this is about, and cool. So, introduction. The perceived threat of the moral error theory motivates much metaethics. Many assume that morality could be subject to some form of error of the kind that would make the moral error theory true. Moral error theorists think this error actual, others do not. Regardless, it does not seem that it is, in some sense, possible that the moral error theory is true. In some sense, moral error theory, and hopefully they'll go into more what moral error theory is here, but we'll find out. Many will think this uncontroversial, a possibility acceptable by all. But I argue that there is a sound argument from the epistemic possibility of the moral error theory to the falsity of both moral noncognitivism and naturalism. This argument also provides reason to believe, with Derek Parfit, that if moral non-naturalism is false, then nothing matters. I proceed as follows. In Section 2, I present my argument. I respond to 3 objections in Section 3. I argue in 4 and 5, respectively, that if true, both non-cognitivism and naturalism cannot capture the epistemic possibility of the moral error theory, which completes the defense of my argument. I conclude in Section 6 by drawing out its aforementioned consequences and explaining that even if non-cognitivists and naturalists remain unmoved by my argument, this only helps to highlight its significance. So I guess he's, I assume it's a he. I'm just going to go with they. We'll see. Let's just give this person a little bit of space, because this is basically just an outline in the first little introduction. Not much of an introduction. It's basically, this is possible, and then here's some consequences, and then that's what we're doing. So, 2. The argument from the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. Call this the argument from the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. P1. It is an epistemic possibility that morality is subject to some wholesale error that would make the moral error theory true. If P2, if P1, then it is an adequacy condition on metaethical theories that they allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of such error. P3. Noncognitivism and moral naturalism cannot allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of such error. C. Conclusion. So noncognitivism and moral naturalism are false. So basically, if you're saying there's a possibility that you could make a wholesale error, then they're saying these theories like moral naturalism, like morality is natural, has to be false. And that's kind of interesting. So let's see how they go about this. All right, good. So now we're getting some definitions. By wholesale error, I mean some error that permeates a discourse such that all of the claims within that discourse are false, or that they are subject to a false presupposition. This kind of error is what afflicts astrology. Astrology is committed to some claims, such as the causal influence of celestial bodies on human personalities, which are false, and so render the entire discourse defective. By wholesale moral error, I mean some error that runs through morality such that the moral error theory is true, and all atomic moral propositions are false. Mackey, 77. Or that they are all subject to false presupposition. So I guess that'd be like, if you had some big morality, like some big theory of ethics, and then all of a sudden it also allowed for just eating babies. And eating babies all the time, and it was good. You might think that whole morality that did everything else and also allowed for eating the children might be just all bunk. And I guess that's what would be the wholesale moral error, assuming you think eating children is a bad thing. So, yeah. All right. The epistemic possibility of the wholesale moral error would mean that, for all we know, an error sufficient to make the moral error theory true obtains. On this view, some proposition P is epistemically possible, just in case P's truth is consistent with all we know. So, eating babies is consistent with everything we know. There's nothing inconsistent about that thought. My argument does not depend on any account of epistemic possibility. It can be, Aristotle, what's up? It's only bad if you use sauce and not a dry rub to eat them. The sin would be in the how you cook. I mean, if you're a bad cook, that's a sin. Otherwise, yeah, have at it. So, I'm with you on that one, Aristotle. My argument does not depend on any account of epistemic possibility. It can be unproblematically cast with other accounts, such as a probabilistic one on which P is epistemically possible. Given our evidence, P has a non-zero evidential probability of being true. On that account, P1 is the plausible claim that, given our evidence, the possibility of the moral error theory being true is above zero. I will occasionally talk in terms of this account to help illustrate my claims below. Returning to astrology. It was once an epistemic possibility that astrology was a non-defective practice. For example, before coming to know its falsity, and thus the epistemic impossibility of astrology being non-defective, the causal influence of celestial objects on human personalities could have been true. And, to be fair to astrology, it was basically astronomy. They thought this was how the planets moved had to do with how everything was. It was just science. So, it's less of a ridiculous thing to think astrology, actually, if you look at it historically. It was actually medicine. People thought that, the orientation of the world had to do with how your health was. For a very long time, at least in the West. I don't know how it was in other, non-Western histories. But, for a very long time. So, the fact that people still think this is it's historically less ridiculous. We know now that astrology doesn't actually do this, but it's not a historically ridiculous thought. So, okay. But the author is saying, let's just get to it. For all we know, moral practice is subject to the kind of error that would make the moral error theory true. Denying this has three unwelcome consequences. The first, it ascribes to moral error theorists a simple epistemic failure, namely that they fail to realize that we already know that the moral error theory is false. Not only is this uncharitable, it seems prima facie false to think either that the error of the error theorist is epistemic in this sense, or that the error theory is immediately refuted by reflection on what we know. Yeah, I mean, if you just say we don't know, that we couldn't be like, well, here's the thing. Could we be wrong? You know, I'm not so sure. You could just deny that, like, no, we're not completely wrong like this. I don't know if that's actually so crazy to deny that, like, you know, we might be a little bit wrong in some cases, or we might be a lot wrong in some cases. But we're not, like, doing something so crazy that, like, it would ruin the whole thing. So I'm not 100% on board with the idea that, like, we could possibly be that wrong. I mean, I'm sort of a everyday sort of person, and as far as these sort of theories go, you have to take into account what people do every day. And so it's like, how wrong are we? Like, is our whole society just wrong? Like, I'm not so sure that's possible. Yeah, and as Aristotle says, there's a big difference between non-zero wrongness and probable wrongness. Yeah, so, like, once you get, like, there's a big difference between, like, the slimmest of slim slivers at zero and then, like, anything else. So it's like, it's just one of these things is, like, vanishingly small. And so I'm not, like, when you say, like, you have to countenance that, I'm not so sure we actually do. Like, do we really have to theorize on the, like, edge case? Not always. So, but anyway, I take the author's point here. It's kind of like, you don't know you're not wrong. You could be wrong. We could be wrong. It's like, so that's a reasonable position. I won't even go with reasonable. It's a defensible position, you could say. All right, so second, it suggests that Aristotle says epistemic possibility is very weak, and we're talking about real world with ethics. Yeah, I think that's a very good distinction to, like, say right here. So this epistemic possibility, in its weakness in some sense, may not actually be the right sort of thing to appeal to in ethics. So even though, like, theoretically it kind of works, but it may be sort of like the wrong type of thing, the wrong category. That's a good point, Aristotle. Second, it suggests that morality is somehow self-protecting from skeptical worries about itself. For to suggest that wholesale moral error is epistemically impossible is to claim that morality is guaranteed to evade wholesale error, which I was actually just defending right there. But this is prima facie implausible. I disagree, author. But that doesn't make me right, but I disagree. Mere appeal to the fact that moral judgments are made, criticized, and the like, or our knowledge of this, for example, does not show that there are no plausible error theoretic worries to be had about morality. Now, so here's the thing. This is completely true. Of course there's plausible error theoretic things to be worried about. Sure. But wholesale morality being wrong, I don't know if that's where we get, like, this the wholesale moral error is not the same thing of having plausible error theoretic worries, but not wholesale worry. So this is, like, again, where I myself and the author diverge. But even so, if you have some small worries, maybe there are bigger worries, and again, a defensible position. This self-protection is especially objectionable for a reason that is the third unwelcome consequence of denying P1. For if moral practice is taken to be self-protecting against error-theoretic worries, then it is unclear how to distinguish between clearly confused domains of discourse, such as astrology and morality. The clearest way to do so is to show how one epistemically could formulate an error theory for either domain before showing why one domain seems clearly subject to wholesale error whilst the other is in dispute. Now, you know what? This might even be a bullet I would be willing to bite. I think the author is correct here. If you don't know, if things are unclear, then you're not sure where something is wrong like astrology and right like astronomy. The problem is the world's a complicated place. Like I was saying earlier, astrology was astronomy for hundreds of years, maybe even thousands. Like, so this is like the history of our Western society here. Basically, there was no astronomy per se. It was all just astrology, and like they were doing the math to figure out the astrological consequences. And so astronomy as we know it was like a subdomain of astrology. It was just the mathematical side of astrology. So it's like, yeah, I might actually bite this bullet to say, look, things are unclear. This is a problem in modern society that we can't understand the difference between pseudoscience and like real science. Like anyone who's walking around in the United States knows that this is a very big point of contention. And so the fact that like there's a way to like get around this is like, I just don't think it's realistic, like at least in terms of everyday practice. So, but again, defensible position here is like, if you want to do this sort of thing, what the author is suggesting is a way to go about it. Oh dear, all right, so here we go. Aristotle says, in this meta-ethics discourse, it's really hard not to beg the question against your opponent. All these non-naturalists are kind of the same. Well, I'm just looking at what has to be the case in order for morality to happen. No, you're not. You're defending a niche position in meta-ethics. And the more abstract the disputes get, the more they might show the meta-ethical debates don't matter to normative systems or applied answers. Yeah, I think that's right. You know more of ethics than I do, and so I wouldn't know what like happens as you get into these debates. But that, from what's going on right here, it's like this author isn't doing anything wrong, but they're sort of just outlining their position. And so the fact that I disagree doesn't really matter, because they're just sort of stating how they're going to go about what they think and like how they're going to proceed, really. So, but yeah, that seems to be the case here. It's like, once you start outlining this stuff, once you start even defining your terms in this way, you have already staked your position out. And that's a lot of what happens in philosophy, is just defining your terms in a certain way that, everything works for what you want to say. And then you have to be careful, of course. You pick it out. The author is really clever. Yes, this is a very well done paper. Even though I disagree, this is like super well done. They've picked good examples. This astrology example is very good. They've set up the argument above in the way of doing it to set their the stage well, so that they get the questions they want and they're going to get to the answers they want. So in some sense, this is a well constructed paper with good examples and a clear argument. Even if you disagree with it, I agree with Aristotle. So, yeah, and if anyone else is out there has questions, feel free to chime in. We're reading this little paper on how bad can we morally mess up. And the title of the paper is on the possibility of wholesale moral error. Like, how bad how confused can our morality actually be? Can all of the whole thing just be wrong? And the author is arguing right here for saying, look, you can't deny that there's a possibility that we're just completely wrong about all of our morals. All right, continuing. So, for at least these reasons, we should accept P1, and that's that there is a possibility that we could be wholesale wrong about all of our morality. But there are also reasons to accept P2. If a meta-ethical theory does not allow for and explain how it epistemically could be that morality is subject to wholesale error, then it faces the above worries. Of course, many meta-ethical theories entail that this epistemic possibility is not realized, and that the error theory is false. But that is consistent with the requirement upon them to show how it epistemically could be that the error theory is true. The moral error theory obviously allows for the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error, and it explains how such error could obtain by maintaining that there are some alleged commitments of moral discourse, such as commitments to irreducibly moral phenomena, which could be that, and which they argue are false. Yeah, so you could think that there's stuff that we are like we really believe, but they're still false, like in terms of morals. Moral non-naturalism also allows for and explains the possibility of wholesale moral error. For the non-naturalist asserts that moral practice has certain commitments, such as to irreducibly moral phenomena, which epistemically could be false, but the non-naturalist argues are not. And crucially, we'll see non-naturalism allows for an explanation of how the error theory epistemically could be true, even if non-naturalism is true. I argue that no form of non-cognitivism or moral naturalism can do so, so they are false. To be clear, my argument is not that these theories, if true, entail moral error theory false. Rather, it is that, if true, they cannot make sense of the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error, whilst moral error theory and moral non-naturalism can. So this is just really sort of fascinating right here. We're just talking about you have to make sense of a possibility. And so you have to make sense of like the possibility of some sort of knowledge, which is an epistemic possibility. And so the idea that you have to like allow for possibility, which is a metaphysical concept, it's like, how do you actually argue against this? So this is an interesting thing that this author is doing here. They're saying because of this really weak thing, you have to be able to, they say they cannot make sense of a possibility, and possibilities are really weak, then these theories have to be wrong. All right, so here's the objections. 3 objections. One might suspect that non-cognitivists and moral naturalists can easily allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. How? By being fallibilists about their own theories, suggesting that their theories might be false, and if so, then the error theory could be true. If such an easy explanation is available, then P3 is false. But no such explanation is available. For a meta-ethical theory to allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error, their explanation must be one they can provide by the lights of their own theory. For example, a naturalist qua naturalist to have an explanation of the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error requires them to provide an explanation that is consistent with the truth of naturalism. If they must withhold assent from or deny their own theory to explain this possibility, then they are providing no explanation of it qua naturalist. While its truth would entail that there is no wholesale moral error, moral non-naturalism nicely illustrates how a non-error theory, even if true, can have the resources to show how moral error is epistemically possible. As we'll see, this is by maintaining that moral practice has certain commitments, the falsity of which would have entailed wholesale moral error, and that the reason why these commitments are true preserves the epistemic possibility that they are false. Okay, so basically we have to keep going, but this is a bit of a mouthful here. So the thing is, it's just, let me know if I'm going a little slow, but it's like you have to stick to your own guns. If you have to say, well, I might be wrong, then you're no longer sticking to your own guns of your own theory. You're doing something else. You're kind of appealing to someone else's theory at that point. And therefore, the naturalist isn't being a naturalist. You're not actually defending it as a naturalist. You're defending it as something else. So they're saying they're changing the hat they're wearing, basically. If you have to change your hat to be like not your naturalist hat, you put on some other hat, then you're not actually defending what you want to be defending as a naturalist. So you have to be careful. And this is a good point. This happens a lot in philosophy. It's that people say, oh, I can do that too, but when they do it, they're not really doing it in the way they're supposed to be. Aristotle says, that feels false to me. A naturalist could hold, for example, that moral property is reduced down to pleasure, pain, happiness, misery, subjectivist preferences, etc. And it feels like I could be wrong. I could be wholesale wrong because one of the other naturalist alternatives is true. Okay, so this is a different sort of question. I'm not sure that's wholesale error, but that's your initial reaction. Yeah, see, that's the thing. It's like you're saying everything is wrong. And so it seems like if you have like an overlapping theory that you could disagree with, that wouldn't be a wholesale error. So this is the problem. Wholesale error is not clear what that actually means either. And I meant to bring this up earlier, so it's good that you bring it up now. I brought up the example of eating babies because that seems like a wholesale error that no one thinks is a good idea to just do like on the regular. But of course, you know, there's been like weird situations where they eat people before and like other people are cannibals and, you know, so maybe that wouldn't actually be wholesale at that point. So that's getting hard, but you know, it's very hard to define a wholesale error, whether it's morality, epistemology, metaphysics, because it's one of these things that in some sense you have to jump out of your own reality to define. So a wholesale moral error would be something that would be outside of your moral scope in terms of your ability to conceive it in some sense to do. So this is a touchy metaphysical problem that this author is sort of not dealing with, and they probably should. And the question is, why, if you're appealing to this, but you can't really give an example or you can't really define it, then you've got the author has sort of this weird metaphysical problem. And I think this is one of the worst issues for this paper. But we can get back to that. Aristotle says, so maybe I do end up sounding like me. Wholesale error for the naturalist would mean we were just evolutionary or socially made up for some purpose we couldn't do. Yeah, for the naturalist. Yeah, that seems right. But again, in what sense would a wholesale error even mean for the naturalist? Because the wholesale error would be would have to be metaphysically it would be a metaphysical error, because I don't even think that the naturalist could even countenance something of that sort, because we would be evolutionary or socially made in a certain way, and so that would be the natural thing. But like, how would you get out of that? If, for example, I could be wholesale wrong about seeing colors and things. See, but like, I don't even understand what that means, Aristotle. I don't even get it. Like, what would it mean to be wrong about seeing colors? Like, I know I see colors. Like, that's one of these phenomenal feedback things. It turns out there's no objects out there to perceive. Again, what would but like, on what grounds would someone even be able to make that claim? I don't even understand like what footing they would have. So it's a very odd thing. Like, these sorts of claims about being wholesale wrong, like, from what perspective are you wholesale wrong? This is the view from nowhere. Yeah. So yeah, you don't buy it at all. I know you're a grounded sort of person. But here's the thing, it's like, where is the perspective of the wrongness here? So it's like, on what perspective? You're definitely not a naturalist. You're from some other thing. And I think this is getting back to what you were saying before. It was people are begging the question and they don't realize it. And so in some sense they're talking cross, like they're just cross purposes, like they're talking past each other. And so what do you mean by wholesale moral error? Like, from what perspective is it an error? And in some sense, at that point, it sort of almost looks like you're playing a spoiler. Everything someone says is, well, not that. Or anytime someone says that, like, I hold this, you say, well, I can get around that. So you're not actually giving a wholesale moral error like theory. You're just playing spoiler to someone else's theory. And that's not the same thing. And you'll actually see spoiler arguments come up every so often. It's not that common, but like, if you ever spot them, you'll realize they're parasitic on the other theories. And so you have to look at them and say, well, what are you actually claiming at this point? And if you're always parasitic on the other theory, you haven't actually gotten away from the other theory. And so I feel that, like, that's even what's really happening here, is that we've got this notion of wholesale error that's not been defined, but we're just saying it's not what something else is. And the negative definition is always a hard sell. So, okay. Yeah, so if you make, what were we saying? Yeah, so it's saying you have to stick to your own guns, and you're saying, well, I can do it by not sticking to my own guns. You know, that is a sort of, I think the author is right here, saying they're ducking out. It's a cop-out. But if you're going to explain something, but again, what I think they're asking the naturalist to explain is something that the naturalist can't even countenance. So that's a thing. But like, if the naturalist attempts to do it by this cop-out, I think this author has them. Because I think that's the argument here is right. If you have to say, well, I might be wrong, well, then you are wrong. If that's your explanation, is that I might be wrong, and then, like, well, you're admitting that your theory is not going to work. Okay, so let's move on to the second objection. And anyone else, please ask questions. I see there's a few people here. A second objection. Suppose the fallibilist, naturalists, and non-cognitivists cannot provide an explanation of the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error qua naturalists or non-cognitivists by pointing out that their theories might be false. Does withholding full commitment not allow such theories some explanation of how, for all we know, it could be that moral error theory is true, namely that their own theories might be false? If so, this might suggest it is not an adequacy condition on metaethical theories that allow for and explain our target possibility, and that proposition 2 from above is false. So now they're just saying, not that my theory might be, I'm allowing my theory to be false, and therefore I don't have to, I can argue that errors might be true. This is, I could say I might be false. Not just that I can ignore it sometimes, but you might just be false. I might be able to ignore it. Okay. Rather, perhaps it is meta-ethicists as epistemic agents who should do this. If there is some epistemic possibility E, and if an agent X who endorses a theory T can make sense of E, despite T's entailing E is not realized, but by withholding full confidence in T, their theory, then why think T itself must be able to account for and explain E? Why would simply withholding full confidence in and from claiming to know T not suffice? Because, as I've argued, metaethical theories that do not allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error, if true, implausibly imply that the error theorist commits a simple epistemic mistake, suggest that morality is self-protecting from external, skeptical worries, and rob us of the clearest way to distinguish morality in clearly confused domains of discourse. To avoid such consequences is metaethical theories themselves that must allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry about the abbreviations. They make the point harder. Basically, all they're doing here is moving up a level. They're saying, even though I'm not saying my theory is wrong sometimes, or might be wrong sometimes, it says the fact that it's possibly wrong. That's all I'm saying. I'm looking at it might possibly be wrong. It's just moving up a level. And the author is saying you can't move up a level. You have to stick to your guns. And the letters here are just fanciness and not helping anyone. Okay. But finally, perhaps any non-error theorist can explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale error without denying their theory in this way. Yeah, see, the first two arguments are basically ways of denying your own theory. I'm not sure they were really that separate. It says 1 and 2. But again, this author's clever. They've built two arguments out of what really is one big argument. So, to make the writing look a little bit more powerful. It's a well-done paper. Whilst their theory entails the error theory is false, the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error remains explainable because, as fallibilists about their own theory, any given non-error theory is consistent with the epistemic possibility of its falsity. So if so, P3 is false. Wait, let me read this again. The epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error remains explainable because as fallible... Alright, they're just being fallibilists. They're saying I could still be wrong. So it's not just that, like, I could be, like, I am wrong. I might be wrong sometimes. But, like, this is just, we're going to be fallibilists about stuff. Alright, to explain. Let T be any non-error theory, E be wholesale moral error, and EPX be that X is epistemically possible, and this possibility is explainable. We are asking if some non-error theory T can capture the fact that something is not explainable, that T entails not the error. And this could be done without denying T so long as we assume that T is consistent with the epistemic possibility of its falsity. That is, T and it's epistemically possible that not T is consistent. So we've got some sort of almost contradictory thing. So you've got a modal... Yeah, we won't get into what this is. This is a very weird statement right here. T and epistemically possible, not T. This assumption may be intuitively plausible, and T and epistemically possible, not T, are obviously logically consistent. But to assume that they are consistent beyond a mere logical consistency is question begging here, for the question now becomes whether T is consistent with epistemically possible, not T, given T, and that T entails not E for some non-error theory T, and if the reason why a specific non-error theory entails not E, and also that not EP, the epistemic possibility V, then this would entail that T and not EP, not T are inconsistent, since the epistemic possibility of not T requires the epistemic possibility of E. I hold that my theory is right, and I hold that it's possible that my theory is not right. Yeah, see, you can say these sorts of things. I've worked on this a little bit in very special situations. The idea that this author is going to pull this out right here, this whole, like, what looks like a contradictory statement, or maybe not so contradictory on how you parse this, like, T and epistemically possible, not T. This is dangerous. And I'll tell you why it's dangerous. It's dangerous because the number of people who are dealing with these sorts of statements is actually rather few. And the why anyone should just believe this author's claim about this being intuitively plausible or implausible shouldn't be accepted at face value at all. This is non-classical logic. You've got these things like EP, which are not defined. What sort of operator is this, like EP of E? I have no idea what this is. So basically it's maybe a modal, and people disagree with this. The epistemic rules for modality aren't set. Yeah, I mean, A, they're not set, and B, people argue about these things, like, not even that they're not set. There's like straight up disagreements about this. And so the idea that, like, I'm going to accept this sort of quasi-logical formal reasoning at face value right here, not happening. So it looks like what they're going to do here is they're going to argue then, like, more in with concepts, but like just from my perspective, this isn't a badly argued paper. It's well argued, but like the understanding of logic here that the author is pushing on us is going to be maybe not idiosyncratic, but it's going to be only one perspective. And again, so it's still in this sort of mindset that this is how to look at the problem, and the rest of us don't have to do that. So, all right, so let's go on. To illustrate, let NN be non-naturalism. NN entails not E, what's not E, and not the wholesale moral error. 100% the argument is tight, it's just stipulated the way that will make them right. Yeah, that's basically, I think, what's going on here. It's well argued, but it's well argued by setting it up to be so. So, the near impossibility of avoiding question begging in this context, which is part of the issue. People are talking past each other. Once you set things up a certain way, it gets really hard to countenance the other person's, the other perspective, the other people's perspective. All right, so non-naturalism entails not the case that of wholesale moral error. Non-naturalists can explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error if non-naturalism and the epistemic possibility of not non-naturalism is consistent. So we must ask if non-naturalism entails not wholesale moral error in a way that also entails it's not possible to epistemically countenance the wholesale moral error. And it does not. Not naturalism entails not the case of wholesale moral error because it entails that there are non-natural moral facts. But non-naturalism also allows that there are certain non-naturalist presuppositions about morality which, if false, would entail the error theory. And crucially, why it entails no wholesale moral errors is consistent with the epistemic possibility of errors because, for all we know, there may be non-natural moral facts, or given our evidence, the probability of non-natural moral facts not existing is above zero. So non-naturalism is consistent with the epistemic possibility of not non-naturalism, since non-naturalism is consistent with the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. Now the question is, I said that without the formulas, and I think this is basically just repeating what we said above. So again, what was the use of the formulas here? Okay, let N be naturalism and NC be non-cognitivism. Oh, so they're just going to run this whole thing with non-cognitivism now. All right, this objection to number 3, the premise 3, succeeds if naturalism and the epistemic possibility of not naturalism, or non-cognitivism and the epistemic possibility of not non-cognitivism are consistent. So we ask, assuming N or NC, and given that they both entail not E, do they do so in a way that entails that it's not possible to epistemically countenance wholesale moral error? If so, this provides an argument that all this stuff are individually inconsistent. Why? Because the truth of naturalism or non-cognitivism would entail not countenancing the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error, and that itself entails not countenancing non-naturalism and not countenancing non-cognitivism. Or not non-cognitivism, since as non-error theories, it is a necessary condition of the epistemic possibility of their falsity that the wholesale moral error is epistemically possible. In what follows, I argue that naturalism and non-cognitivism cannot allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error theory on the supposition that they are true. This is because if true, they entail wholesale moral error not just false, but I argue epistemically impossible and or inexplicable. This shows that they not only cannot capture the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error if their theories are true, but they cannot do so by suggesting their theories epistemically could be false. For if true, in denying a necessary condition for the epistemic possibility of their own falsity, these theories actually entail that it is epistemically impossible for them to be false. Okay, so basically I think all of the logic was just in service of what they were saying above. I don't know if it actually added a whole lot. It's nice that they set it up in a way that you can formalize the argument, but again, as Aristotle pointed out, I don't know if it added much other than a repetition of the premises. But okay, let's see if where we're gonna go. We got another few pages of this. All right, so. And feel free to ask questions along the way. Non-cognitivism and the possibility of wholesale moral error. Now, for well-known reasons, there remains no uncontroversial account of the cognitivist-non-cognitivist divide. But on standard ways of distinguishing between them, non-cognitivists are unable to allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error, risking nostalgia for halcyon days past, truth-apt. Cognitivism is the view that moral judgments are truth-apt beliefs. Non-cognitivism denies this, maintaining instead that moral judgments are non-truth-apt, desire-like states. Truth-apt just means something that could be true or false, and non-cognitivism here says it's more like feeling a desire. So it's not true or false to feel like desire for ice cream or something. So it's just that's something you feel. It's not something that would be true or false. Yeah, so during the time of Ayer's emotivism and Hare's prescriptivism, I don't know how to say Hare, truth-apt sufficed. It suffices to show why these older forms of non-cognitivism rule out the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. For if moral claims are desire-like states such as emotional responses and are not truth-apt, then such a view cannot explain how it could be that there was some kind of error in moral practice that would render all moral claims false. Contemporary non-cognitivists claim they are able to consistently make sense of moral claims being true and expressing beliefs by appeal to minimalism. The sentence P is true expresses the same attitude as the sentence P, and a sentence expresses a belief if and only if it can be true. This allows them to claim that a sentence like abortion is wrong expresses some non-cognitive attitude, like disapproval of abortion, whilst also expressing a true belief. This suggests what is perhaps the most common way of casting our divide: representation. Cognitivism claims that the moral judgments aim to represent the world, and that whether they succeed depends wholly on whether the world has the moral feature such judgments ascribed to them. Non-cognitivists deny this, maintaining instead that moral judgments do not aim to represent the world. Something like this seems to distinguish cognitivism from non-cognitivism that quasi-realists like Blackburn and Gibbard accept. On, for example, Blackburn's view, whilst moral judgments can be true. Oh, you got Qigong stretch. I'll be in one sec. On, for example, Blackburn's view, whilst moral judgments can be true and express beliefs in these minimalist senses, moral judgments are expressions of non-cognitive attitudes of approval or disapproval. All right, cool. So let's stretch in a Tai Chi way, or Qigong way. Don't know if you're going to be able to see this. My current setup is kind of crap for this. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do it sitting. Oh, dear. So, one hand up, one hand down. And what we're going to do is try and get one shoulder to go up and one shoulder to go down. That way, you get a nice back stretch. So one hand pushes against the ceiling, the other hand pushes against the floor. And then you switch it up. This way you get you get a little curve in your back, not the way you are expecting. So it's like you're the upper back is sort of like kind of going like this and like that. All right. So again, push up with the right hand, down with the left hand. So this hand is like pushing down this way, and this hand is sort of like raising the roof. So you can do this sitting and standing. Okay, doke. Cool. Thank you, Brandy B. Back before the giant mess you see behind me, I was planning on doing like a bunch of like these stretching for streamers. I still plan on doing it at some point, but like a whole bunch of things to like people who sit in their desks all day. They need to like stretch out their backs, their arms, all of this. And one of these days I'll get around to it. Okay, so we were talking about cognitivism and non-cognitivism. Cognitivism basically has to do with representing the world. So when you say something moral in the world, it is saying, well, this is how the world should be, like it's representing like the world in some sense. And when you're saying something in a non-cognitive sense, when you say something is bad, you're just expressing how you feel about it. It's not actually representing the world. It's expressing some sort of state that you're in. So. Okay, these quasi-realist forms of non-cognitivism cannot allow for and explain epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. We might think that allowing moral judgments to minimalistically to be minimalistically true or false would suffice for this, but that is a mistake. Okay. For what is needed to explain how a domain of discourse could be in wholesale error is more than just allowing that claims within that domain could all be false or subject to a false presupposition. Rather, one needs to show that there are some commitments of the domain itself that allow for, and whose falsity would explain, the kind of wholesale error that would entail an error theory for that domain. The same holds for morality. It does not suffice to allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error, and for one to maintain that moral error claims are all capable of truth or falsehood. Rather, we need to we need an explanation for how and why they epistemically could all be false or subject to false presupposition. I think I know where this is going. Both the non-naturalist and the error theorist can provide this. The non-cognitivist and the quasi-realist variety cannot, for their view does not ascribe any commitments to the practice of morality, the falsity of which would entail all moral claims are false or are subject to a false presupposition. Take Blackburn's view. Moral judgments express attitudes of approval or disapproval. Moral judgments can be minimalistically true and involve some form of projection of our non-cognitive attitudes onto actions and other morally valuable things. This eliminates anything that could explain how and why it could be that all of our moral judgments are false, since they are only expressing our attitudes, even if, in principle, they could all be false. Yeah, so this is where I thought we were going. If you are a non-cognitivist and you think, when you say, like, you express that is bad, you're saying kind of like, boo, you're just going boo with that thing. How could everything how are you possibly countenancing the possibility that everything in your morality is wrong? You can't, because you're doing something sort of too simple to actually allow for the possibility that all of your morality is wrong if you're just booing at somebody. If you're just booing at somebody, you can't actually explain how there's a possibility embedded in your booing. And so that's kind of what the argument is here. And in some sense, if you accept what the author said, I think this is an excellent argument. If you bought a lot of what the author was saying above. So, I mean, it's like, I think this is right given the author's setup. Okay. One might object that this is too quick against contemporary non-cognitivism in quasi-realist garb. In particular, perhaps it is false that a theory needs to identify some commitments of a discourse whose falsity would entail wholesale error in order to explain the possibility of such an error. An alternative. One's theory may have counterfactual implications which, if true, would explain how there could be a wholesale error. For example, Blackburn's quasi-realist could suggest that if moral agents fail to express any attitudes of approval or disapproval, then all moral claims would be false or subject to some false presupposition. This counterfactual strategy, even if workable, is of no help to the quasi-realist. This is because if quasi-realism accepted the counterfactual above, this would turn it into a response-dependent theory. But quasi-realism emphatically deny their theory entails this, fearing the relativistic implications of response-dependence theories. So this move is unavailable to them. Yeah, see, as soon as you start watering stuff down, it doesn't usually work, but that's fair. The question is, is this just a straw man, and is this really their only let's go to the next. I think this is exactly where the author is going. The quasi-realist may now complain that I am assuming they think the existence of moral attitudes suffices for moral truth. But quasi-realists allow that not all attitudes are equal. Some attitudes are correct when approving of what is good, right, and the like. And others, like that of the bigot or the racist, based on inconsistency, cruel-mindedness, and immaturity, lack of imagination, bias, coarseness, and so on, are incorrect. Alright, so let's get to Aristotle quick. What's kind of funny here is that we can call Tollens instead of ponens on the author's argument. If I had to choose between A, preserving a remote epistemic possibility that morality is wholesale wrong, and B, preserving a practical theory that allows me to live a richer, fuller life, then I'm going with B all day, and it just shows why a lot of these non-naturalist worries, a la Derek Parfit, are silly. Yeah, well, this is basically, I think that's dead on. You can just deny that what they're saying is a relevant possibility or is relevant for the morality here. So if you take option B and you're preserving more practical theory, then Why would you want to hold on to a remote epistemic possibility? Now, if you are on the metaphysical side of things and you think your remote epistemic possibility is like ingrained in the universe, then you have to hold that really tight. But again, it's different sorts of people here. You've got people who are on the metaphysical side, the logical side, that they really, really need their theory. And then there's the people, yeah, that's basically it. It's like, but then you can't do that. You can't play my metaethical game. Yeah, and you're okay. It's like, that's fine. You go play with your math over there while I'm dealing with real world problems over here. But again, that's not to like, that's a little mean in terms of what like this author is doing here. But in some sense, you have to work out the background theory too. And so that's kind of what's going on here. So you don't want to just be like too dismissive of either side, because you need the theory and you also need the practicality here, because the theory has to match up with the if you're doing something like this, there has to be a point of contact with the real world. If you're doing ethics, it has to connect with the real world in some sort of moral or ethical way. Yeah, I agree the guy's real good at what he's doing, but like in some sense, what are you doing when you're doing you're writing about ethics? You are talking about some sort of moral interaction with other people, with the world, something. So where does it line up? And like for other parts of philosophy too, like if you're doing logic, that has very weird consequences for other things. But like we're not getting into that now. Like what exactly is a variable in logic? First order of logic, the objects of first order of logic are supposed to be first order objects. Like, but what does that mean? And then you have to actually have huge, and I mean huge, presuppositions about claims about what the world is like, the ontology of the world. But like these are the questions here. And so the idea is like, where is this author connecting up with the real world? And if the author is connecting up with the real world with an epistemic possibility, you can ask, well, what is your moral ontology then, if epistemic possibility is more important than your moral ontology? Are you really an ethicist, or are you an epistemologist? And then you have a question of like, what is actually going on here? Like if you're just trying to preserve your epistemology and then you're making claims about morality, maybe that's a confused way about arguing about this. You wonder sincerely, will losing wholesale moral wrongness affect large-scale coordination? I don't really think so. No, I doubt that it would. Although wholesale moral wrongness, I could see a whole bunch of people wanting to really put their foot down and say, no, we are not wholesale morally wrong. But then I see a whole lot of people saying, look, you just don't know what the heck you're talking about. Of course we could be wholesale and morally wrong. A lot of skeptics out there. And so I could see a whole lot of people, just on like the sort of the skeptical attitude and how dumb we humans can be, that like, yeah, wholesale moral wrongness actually might not be the worst position to defend either. But like, I don't think it has anything to do with coordination. So, but like, that's another question. Like, again, if it doesn't affect large-scale coordination, maybe that's a way to argue against this. Like, if you're going to say wholesale moral wrongness has nothing to do with large-scale coordination, then maybe there's something that isn't really wholesale about it. So, even if like all of our ethics are wrong, it has nothing to do with coordination, and ethics has to do with coordination. Yeah, maybe. There might be a criticism there. Alright, so where were we? Yeah, so we're saying, they don't want to be response dependent, because of course they want to just say, well, this is sort of how we, like, this is a motive response, not it's not dependent on what's going on in the world, it's how we are that it matters for these theories. Okay. The quasi-realist may know, this is the complaint. Not all attitudes are equal, but again, there's going to be a half measure, and the author's going to argue against this. How then can quasi-realists understand mistaken moral attitudes? Unfortunately, quasi-realists refuse to provide any account of moral error. Responding to Egan's objection that quasi-realists cannot explain certain kinds of individual moral error, Blackburn remarks, let's first consider moral correctness or moral truth. Does the quasi-realist set about saying what this is? No. Just as a quasi-realist avoids naturalistic reductions, so he avoids saying what it is for a moral claim to be true, except in boring homophonic or deflationary terms. As with truth, so with error. Moral P is mistaken or erroneous if and only if not P, and that is all that can be said. This leaves the quasi-realist with no explanation of how and why all moral attitudes epistemically could be false, even if it explains how some are. Still, Blackburn does suggest that quasi-realists can accept this consistently with their truth minimalism. Improvement. If something is entrenched in anyone's outlook in such a way that nothing that is an improvement would undermine it, then it is true. By contraposition, then quasi-realists can apparently say, see improvement. If something entrenched in anyone's outlook is false, then there's something that is an improvement that would undermine it, giving us all improvement. If all moral attitudes entrenched in all of our outlooks are mistaken, then there is an improvement or set of improvements that would undermine all of our moral attitudes. So if it is epistemically possible that there is an improvement or set of improvements that would undermine all of our attitudes, perhaps quasi-realists can appeal to all improvement to explain epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. What might such improvements be that epistemically could undermine all of our attitudes? There are two such options. External, all moral attitudes may be undermined by some metaethical considerations. Internal, all moral attitudes may be undermined by some moral considerations. Yeah, I mean, fair. Okay, external requires some feature or presupposition of morality that, for example, metaphysical inquiry could undermine, such as commitments to non-natural facts. We've seen that quasi-realists deny this, and whilst quasi-realists think some attitudes better than others, they deny that the explanation for this involves anything beyond normative theorizing. Okay, yeah. But again, then why would they even allow this? Okay, so then we go to internal. The quasi-realist, however, might appeal to internal. Yeah, they wouldn't go with the external, so... The quasi-realist, however, might appeal to internal and say, it is epistemically possible that we are systematically wrong about the correct normative ethics. That possibly might undermine all of our moral attitudes. Since quasi-realism is consistent with that epistemic possibility, it can allow for and explain wholesale moral error. But suppose we all have mistaken moral attitudes because we are all deluded about what the correct normative ethical theory is. This alone would show that our current moral attitudes are false. It would not show that all adoptable moral attitudes are false, since assuming quasi-realism, there are still some correct moral attitudes one can adopt in line with the best normative ethics, even if we are wrong about which attitudes those are. But without that, quasi-realism is not explaining the possibility of wholesale moral error of all moral attitudes being mistaken. Yeah, that seems okay. So let's just get to the end of this, because this is actually, it looks like they have like a very small window to get out. They can say, you know what, we could be wrong because on this, all moral attitudes might be undermined by some moral considerations. Even if some of them are wrong, maybe there's one that's all of them are wrong. This answers that criticism we had at the beginning. Here he's defending the wholesale. Yes. But again, defending the wholesale, not defining it. Quasi-realists must then suggest that it is epistemically possible that our moral attitudes would be mistaken even after alignment with the best normative ethical theory. What the heck is best normative ethical theory? Whatever. Best. This would be straightforward if, like non-naturalism, quasi-realism recognized some presupposition that, say, moral metaphysical inquiry could show mistaken. But denying this, quasi-realists can only appeal to the normative considerations, saying, for all we know, the best normative ethical theory is one on which, for example, both racists and non-racists and bigots and non-bigots alike are mistaken. Okay. That, I submit, is an epistemic impossibility. Why? I think you're just, okay, so it would be hard. This is all we're saying at this point. That the author doesn't believe that you can be so confused that the racists and non-racists are wrong at the same time, in the same way. This is getting really touchy because, look, yeah, if you're doing, like, straight up logic, yeah, you can do that. If we're talking about, like, ethical things, this ain't so clear that follows, like, just abstract logic. Now, this is, that they submit is an epistemic impossibility. Why? Why? All right, let's see what the author says. For we know that the attitudes of the non-racist or non-bigot are not ones that can be improved upon as moral attitudes. Do we? Are we so sure of our moral attitudes in that case? That seems very, I'd hope so that we are right, but that doesn't mean it can't be improved. This is not, see, I try hard not to be a jerk. I do not always succeed at not being a jerk. And I can say it's like, you grow up with certain ideas, you grow up and you learn some of them were bad when you were younger, and you get older and you realize that's it. So the idea that we think we're not racist or not bigoted in some way, it's like, yeah, we're trying our best. You're gonna fail sometimes. And so like the idea that we just are assuming like these terms mean one thing or another, we're not always right about that. And so again, this is taking a lot of theory up here and saying, what is it to be non-racist or non-bigoted? And you're assuming, look, we understand that. I don't know if I understand that. I understand something about it. Okay, this is not to say, inconsistently with the premise one above, that it is epistemically impossible that there is wholesale moral error. Rather, it is to say that we know non-bigot and non-racist attitudes are not the ones that can be morally improved upon, even if morality, for reasons quasi-realists deny, is subject to wholesale moral error and say wholly fictional. Since this appeal to a moral improvement that would undermine all moral attitudes relies upon the epistemic impossibility that we can improve some clearly morally unimprovable attitudes, quasi-realism cannot explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. Blackburn's quasi-realist takes themselves to stand on one part of the Neurath boat and inspect the other parts when doubting moral attitudes, and that'd be the boat that's being taken apart and put back together at the same time. So it's like you're just sort of balancing on the non-busted part, and you're looking at the busted part, and then you're fixing one part, and you're just sort of moving pieces around. So the idea is like they're sort of juggling is what the author is accusing Blackburn of. Quasi-realism does place us firmly on Neurath's boat, but I've argued it is mistaken to think that we need not explain how it is epistemically possible that we could be doing something wrong by being on the boat at all. That I've argued the quasi-realist cannot do. Yeah, the author is just saying you don't want to be in this sort of juggling position. This failure generalizes to other non-cognitivist theories such as sentimentalism or pragmatism. For example, take a pragmatism on which moral practice is best understood as an attempt to create and adopt norms to aid in meeting some practical goals. And I think this is getting closer to what you were saying about coordination, practical goals, such as solving problems of interpersonal interactions. Such a theory cannot appeal to anything about about the practice of morality itself, which, if mistaken, would entail wholesale moral error. Aristotle says that it's not clear that A, morality can be carved into discrete propositions, or B, that any general proposition attitude really matters if it can't be applied right. Yeah, and you're something of the pragmatist? Yeah, I could see that. Yeah, so I mean, the question is, again, this is applying the theory to like the practicality, and it cannot appeal to anything about the practice of morality itself, which, if mistaken, would entail wholesale moral error. Because, yeah, see, this is the thing. What sort of theory are we doing right here? If you can't appeal to like practice of morality itself. So what are you doing? How do you even know what the morality is? So the question is, if you're having a wholesale moral error, you can't appeal to morality. What are you relying upon? And then the question becomes weird, because clearly the author thinks the other folks can rely on the theory. And is that really what you want in your ethical theory, is just to be doing everything out of theory? Like, is that what you want in your morality? Is an accounting book? I'm not sure. Okay. At best, the pragmatist could maintain that their sincere engagement in moral discourse will frustrate the practical goals of moral practice. But to think that this allows them to capture the epistemic possibility with which we are concerned conflates two distinct forms of wholesale error: veritistic error, such that all claims within a domain are false or subject to some false presupposition; non-veritistic error, such that sincere engagement in some domain of discourse or practice will lead to failing to achieve some practical goals or aims that that discourse or practice. Our pragmatists and other non-cognitivists who insist the only goals or aims of moral practice are practical ones can explain how engaging in moral practice could meet the non-veritistic theory right here, that you will lead to failing to achieve some practicals. You're definitely going to fail if you're sometimes. Yeah. Perhaps, for example, moral practice will frustrate fruitful coordination of human action, a claim cognitivists and non-cognitivists alike could accept. But I have suggested there is another sense of wholesale error epistemically possible regarding morality: veritistic. And if morality is claimed to be concerned only with the creation and adoption of various norms to help achieve some practical goals, then these forms of non-cognitivism cannot allow for and explain veritistic wholesale moral error. So that everything could be false or subject to some false presupposition. Okay, so almost done. Well, page 8, let's see, what do we got to? Yep, so we got to get to 10 basically. Naturalism and the possibility of wholesale moral error. Moral naturalism also fails to explain for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error. To begin to see why, take a simple form of moral naturalism. Suppose moral rightness is identical to the natural property of happiness maximization. If so, then it is epistemically impossible for there to be wholesale moral error, since while some moral judgments about which actions maximize happiness may be false, the view lacks any explanation of how and why all moral judgments could be subject to a kind of error that would make all of them false, or subject to a false presupposition, because we know that at least some judgments concerning which acts maximize happiness are true. I don't know if we know that. I think you'd kind of take it on faith that you kind of get it right sometimes. But I don't know. Now consider, for example, Relton's 86 Moral Naturalism. Relton tries to capture the purported features of morality by appeal to what is non-morally good for as an agent, where what is non-morally good for an agent is understood as what an agent's fully informed counterpart would do. This captures a kind of objectivity, Relton argues, because what a fully informed counterpart chooses is non-morally good due to objective features of one's circumstances and constitution. This is the what would Jesus do argument. Like, what would Jesus do? What is the, like, if you knew the moral perfection, what would someone who was morally perfect do? It's like, yeah. But, like, how exactly do you do that? Relton's theory, if true, entails that it is epistemically impossible that there is wholesale moral error, because if this person exists, the morally perfect person, then there is no possibility that they are wholesale wrong. Aristotle says, I used to be more sympathetic to moral error theory before this paper. Now I'm thinking is equivalent to a pot-induced, yeah, but what if, man? I think I said earlier that this is kind of a spoiler theory. Spoiler theories rub people the wrong way. I wouldn't color all error theories as spoiler theories, but they are definitely, it's more likely to be getting a spoiler theory when you get into an error theory. And so you have to be careful not to be angry at the argumentation, because they're just trying to spoil everyone else's like theory. And then sort of beat you over head with all the failures. Boom, boom, boom. Everything fails, everything fails, everything fails. Come to the error side of things, like come to the dark side. But that doesn't maybe give like maybe the good error theorists their due. Yeah. Again, I'm not really that sympathetic to error theory either. But I'm afraid I'm afraid that like you might be shooting the messenger, where the messenger is sort of like the medium here. Like the way this person is arguing is sort of beating you over the head with error after error after error, and said, look, it's all errors. So, but this isn't a positive argument for error theory. This is against the other theories. Yeah. All right. So Relton's theory, if true, entails that it is epistemically impossible that there is wholesale moral error. To not entail that, it would have to be epistemically possible for there to be nothing that is not morally good for an agent to explain why all moral claims are false or subject to a false presupposition, but this is implausible. Whilst there may be cases where nothing is non-morally good for an agent, we know that at least some things will be non-morally good for agents in some circumstances. It could be bad PR for error theory. My messenger said what? Yeah. Yeah. Again, this paper isn't arguing for error theory in some sense. It's arguing against the other theories, and then the error theory being the default alternative. And so it's a negative argument. Now, you don't have to love negative arguments. Like, it's not arguing for error theory, but that doesn't mean It just means you have to find some way to defend against this argument, which I think we've discussed actually in ways that this sort of begging the question a few times may show that like you don't have to accept these arguments. Okay. But does naturalism not entail that morality has certain presuppositions which, if false, would entail wholesale moral error? Namely, that if certain natural phenomena did not exist, then there would be wholesale moral error. And would this not explain how, on naturalism, the moral error theory could be true? Naturalist theories can allow that there are some presuppositions of moral practice which, if not met, would, in principle, entail that all moral claims are false or subject to false presupposition. But the problem for naturalists is that the way they argue these constraints are met, in fact, entails, if true, that it is epistemically impossible that they are not met. So epistemically impossible that there is wholesale moral error if naturalism true. Aristotle says, right, yeah, the author is most sympathetic to non-naturalism as saying that we have to be able to explain what the moral error theorist is up to. And if we can't, we're worse off. Yeah, that's the general structure of what's going on here. It's like you have to be able to explain what's going on, and if you can't explain what's going on, your theory is deficient. Now the question is this the right sort of thing to be explaining in this domain? And I think we both disagree that this sort of epistemic possibility is not the right sort of thing to be explaining. So I think for different reasons, actually. Like I'm on the what the heck, or where is the epistemic possibility of moral error theory connecting with the world in terms of your morality, and I think you're looking at this from the practical side of things. So yeah, but yeah, like if you are on this side of things, I think this is a good essay. It's just the question is, what are you looking at here? And as you're just saying, if you think it is at least important to explain this sort of what the possibility of error theory, then yeah, this is an interesting argument. Okay. Identifying moral rightness with natural facts about happiness maximization would make it epistemically impossible that there is wholesale moral error, since it is epistemically impossible that no judgments about happiness maximization are true, and if true, Relton's theory must allow for the epistemic possibility of no choice an agent's counterpart can make being non-morally good for an agent. And we know this is false. At least some facts about one's constitution and circumstance will make at least some choices good for an agent. So in trying to explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error by appeal to what we already know to be epistemically impossible, this response fails. Yeah, so if you can ask what would Jesus do, and if you're at least a little bit like that guy Jesus, or like the best version of yourself, then you're saying, look, we can't be completely wrong because someone kind of like us is right sometimes. Makes sense for a journal like Ratio. Yeah, this is a technical argument journal in some sense. So, good paper in a good journal. It doesn't have to be your cup of tea, but good paper in a good journal. So, okay. Railton may object. Why think that some facts about one's constitution and circumstances will always make at least some choices good for an agent? Isn't an agent with a certain constitution and circumstances such that none of their available options is either good or bad for them? Oh, party yardy. Ooh, finally caught with a live stream. Thank you for stopping by. I hope you're doing well. How are you doing today? We're reading this paper on wholesale moral error. How bad could we be mistaken about our morality? Still a grad student, and he's published half a dozen papers in A-tier journals. Well, good for this fellow. Guy, girl, whatever. Otherwise. Yeah, I mean, if you can write like this, and you can, this is the sort of thing that will sell. Like, this sort of writing sells in academic philosophy. So that's good. I mean, just because Aristotle and I have disagreed with the author here, that's actually a very good sign for this paper, that there are clear disagreements. We can talk about them, and that means there's something to discuss here. So just because we disagree, and for different reasons, that's actually an excellent sign that there's things to be discussed. Authors put out a thesis that like makes sense in terms of like people discussing it, and so that's usually all right. Secret for you out there, all you like not like well published people, you don't have to write a good paper. You have to write a paper that the people who make decisions want to talk about. You are writing a paper that the gateholders, that would be the editors and the reviewers, if they think it's a good discussion, they will publish the paper because they will think it's like, oh, I can, use this for my stuff. I can talk about this. That is one of the things the author has done very well here. They have given people something to bite into. And so this is one of the, in terms of rhetoric of academic philosophy, this paper has done excellently. They have given the establishment something that they can talk about and work with. And in some sense, that is a very important thing about when you write your papers. Have you given the other people in your profession something that they can work with? And you can do that in various ways. Like you can be good at history and like talk about the history of philosophy, so people have lots of ways in. This person is giving lots of different examples and arguments that people can toy with. A lot of toy examples here. A lot of different people they're talking about in different ways. And so just in terms of how this person has gone about their argumentation, you can see that I don't know if they're doing this consciously, but they're definitely giving it's sort of a juicy paper, at least for this sort of stuff. So, and that's how you get yourself published in a half dozen A-tier journals. And that's why oddballs don't get published, not because they have bad philosophy, it's because the people who hold the reins want to be able to talk about stuff. And if you're not talking about what they want to talk about in a way they want to talk about it, then you're not going to get published. It's very simple. They have to think it's worth talking about. All right, so continuing. So could it be possible your most morally perfect self, that all of their available options is neither good or bad, or that they're not epistemically possible, any of their available options? Okay, suppose that such an agent were epistemically possible. This would mean that it is epistemically possible that nothing can be good or bad for that agent. For them, then nothing is morally good or bad. But this falls short of wholesale moral error. For that, Railton's naturalist needs to show that all agents epistemically could be such that their constitution and circumstances make nothing either good or bad for them, as that is what would be required for no moral claim to be true, and not just true or false as entertained by some agent. Actually, this is really interesting right here, because there's a weird problem that just came to my mind. Imagine the best version of yourself. What would Jesus do if Jesus were me and Jesus were faced with the ethical problems? As you know, what would Jesus do, sort of question. The really weird thing about that is there is no good or bad for Jesus. Jesus just does whatever Jesus would want to do, because it would be what we would consider good or bad. But for Jesus, we have no actual consideration what it would mean to be good or bad for Jesus. Jesus, we have no concept of that, none whatsoever. And so I don't even know if the question means that there's anything either good or bad for them. For all I understand it, nothing is either good or bad for Jesus. They just do stuff. And it would be sanctioned by God, but that is how we define good or bad, by someone in this position. That would be how they define good or bad, but that's not how the person doing it. That's not how the deity themselves would consider it, I don't think. So the funny part is actually, even though this is an excellent argument for this author, I think it actually fails. So what would be the standards for God to consider something good or bad? They would not have any standards. That's how we judge our standards, by looking at the God. So, the moral perfection, I guess, if you don't want to say God. But yeah, so that's the question, is actually that I think the author has actually overstepped on this, on the bounds here. And so this is an interesting thing. I think this argument actually technically fails, even though it would take a lot of... For me to construct this, it would be a little weird. Euthyphro 2.0? Yeah. Okay. But continuing. But that is epistemically impossible. We know that agents in our world are such that some things are non-morally good or bad for them. Railton can allow for and explain how all moral claims could be false only if he can show that it is epistemically possible that all agents are so constituted or circumstanced such that they have no needs. That latter claim, however, is false, so Railton cannot capture the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error on the supposition that his naturalism is true. This problem generalizes to any form of moral naturalism. In principle, naturalists can suggest that the simple or complex natural phenomenon they take the moral to be identified with, reducible to, or fully grounded in, may not exist, so that moral claims are false. But as realists, they maintain that such phenomena do exist, and some moral claims are true. Their identification reduction of the moral to the natural is made partly to fend off the error theorist. If true, however, their theory lacks any explanation of how moral practice could be subject to wholesale moral error, since, as we've seen, realist candidates for such identification reduction are ones that, and we know, do exist. And see, right here, the author betrays themselves. Right here, they do it. Their identification reduction of the moral to the natural is made partly to fend off the error theorist. They won't care that they don't have error theory. They don't want it. And so, like, right here, after they had to make this very strong, weird argument, they had to, in some sense, this is like one of those, what's it called? Leopards ate my face, or one of those, like, no. What's it called online? It's where they got so close to like understanding what's going on, and then they miss the point. They just they've argued so hard in one position that they actually came all the way around to the other side, and they didn't realize it. So that's exactly what happened here. It's that these people don't want error theory, and the fact that you're trying to push it on them is they don't care. They don't want it to begin with. So, yeah. Okay. And they must be. For if the moral naturalist identified or reduced the moral to some natural phenomena that do not exist, then moral naturalist would be an error theorist in disguise. But moral naturalists are not error theorists, and to respond to my argument, they need to accommodate the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error without collapsing into error theory. I have argued that they cannot do so, and we have argued that they would not want to do so. It is instructive to recall how not... What is that term? I'm blanking because I'm on like Reddit all day at work. And, what the heck is it called? It's not leopards ate my face. It's, shoot. I'm blanking on the term. It's where you end up, completely going over the deep end and not realizing that you're arguing for your competitor right there. Okay, it is instructive to recall how non-naturalism avoids this problem, for the non-existence of the non-natural is epistemically possible, since for all we know they may not exist. So, or given our evidence, the probability of non-natural phenomena not existing is above zero. So even if true, alleged non-naturalist presuppositions of morality epistemically could be false, since the non-existence of non-natural moral phenomena is epistemically possible. The naturalist, by contrast, appeals to the natural phenomena of the non-existence of which, as we've seen, is an epistemic impossibility. This completes the response to the final objection to P3 considered in Section 2. The objection suggested that naturalism and non-cognitivism can allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error by claiming their theories epistemically could be false even if they're true. This assumed that both theories are consistent with the epistemic possibility of their own falsity, but since both theories, if true, entail that there is no wholesale moral error, in a way that also entails that wholesale moral error is epistemically impossible or inexplicable, and since the epistemic possibility of the falsity of their theories as non-error theories requires the possibility of wholesale moral error, neither theory is consistent with the epistemic possibility of their own falsity. Anyone out there, read your papers out loud. You'll realize you're writing run-on sentences, because I read a lot of these. You have to read them out loud because these sentences are just too long at this point. Another little thing, because you can cut it up, but if you're writing it, you don't realize it. So, naturalists and non-cognitivists cannot explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error qua naturalists or non-cognitivists, either by saying such possibility remains and is explicable if their theories are true, or by supposing their theories epistemically could be false even if they take them to be true. P3 then is true, so naturalism and non-cognitivism are false. Conclusion. Derek Parfit famously argued that if moral non-naturalism is false, then nothing matters. And some prominent non-naturalists, such as David Enoch, take the non-naturalist most respectable not the non-naturalist's most respectable opponent to be the moral error theorist. Parfit's claim has been much discussed. It is noteworthy that my argument provides independent reason to accept Parfit's claim and justifies Enoch's attitude. For if neither non-cognitivism nor moral naturalism can allow for and explain the epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error, then they are false. Both families of theories, I have argued, simply fail to recognize morality epistemically could be subject to veritistic wholesale error, because such error is epistemically possible, and if only non-naturalism and the error theory can capture this, and then if non-naturalism is false, nothing matters. The only question of whether it is an epistemic possibility that there is wholesale moral error is, I suspect in Richard Rorty's words, one of those issues which puts everything up for grabs at once, whether there is no point in trying to find agreement about the data or about what would count as deciding the question. For the committed non-cognitivist or moral naturalist will likely be unmoved by my heart. Sorry. For the committed non-cognitivist or moral naturalist will likely be unmoved by my argument. They might instead bite the bullet and accept that it is a consequence of their theories that veritistic wholesale moral error is epistemically impossible. This, they may think, is all the better for them and a nice argument against error theory. To grant P1, they may continue, would be to already assume a way of thinking about morality they deny, perhaps motivating a charge of question begging against me. Yes, that's what we think is happening here. But my argument can be accused of question begging only in a weak sense that includes a premise someone already committed to the truth of non-cognitivism or moral naturalism will deny. Most philosophical arguments unavoidably contain such a premise, and the important question becomes whether we find non-cognitivism or moral naturalism, or the claim that there is an epistemic possibility of wholesale moral error, more plausible. The committed non-cognitivist or moral naturalist will unsurprisingly think the former. We face then a Morean standoff. Yeah, so this is the gut check moment in the last paragraph. They're saying, yeah, we know there's exactly going to be a problem because no one's going to believe me. And so what was the point of this whole exercise then? I'm not sure, but here's the author's chance at the last getting the last word in. But as Rorty continues, the messiness of the issue is not a reason for setting it aside. I have provided reasons to think the denial of the epistemic possibility of wholesale veritistic moral error is implausible. But even if these will not convince the unrepentant, my argument can serve other crucial functions. First, it may convince those as yet undecided over these theories to reject non-cognitivism and moral naturalism. Second, it reveals a consequence of said theories that it may convince those previously attracted to them but unaware of this consequence to reject them. Third, arguments that lead to Morean intuitional standoffs reveal some of the bedrock issues that divide us within philosophy. And sometimes these bedrock issues are also ones where everything is up for grabs at once. It is an important form of philosophical progress to identify such doubly troubling issues. What to do once we do so, we'll have to wait for another time. And Rorty, as Aristotle says, Rorty is also a committed pragmatist. Yeah. So this is one of these, like, yeah, we wrote a whole paper on this thing, but in the end it doesn't really matter sort of stuff. It's just like, but it was really good. Like, what we did was good, though. Even though we're not sure we convinced anybody it was really good. They did a great job. Like, I have to say, like, and as Aristotle says, they did a really good job in this paper. If you are on this sort of side of the divide, I think they presented a lot of they well presented some arguments, you know, like it was like nicely done. They got some arguments. They sort of see Aristotle, A+ paper for a grad student. I'm not like, I don't love this stuff. You disagree with everything. I still think they presented the sides fairly by the end. Yeah, you see, I'm an angry person. Like, I'm really a curmudgeon. Like, I don't even think you even understand how much of a curmudgeon I am. Like, the fact that they missed the boat on what they're talking about here, it's like, yeah, you don't get the A+, you get the A- because you missed the boat on what the point of morality is. You're writing about morality the whole time, but then you fall down onto the side of epistemic possibility. And you don't realize you're confusing two different categories here. That is what's getting me this whole time. It's a really good paper. All right, you win the day, though, party already, for that that claim. So yeah, you're definitely free to go to be played ho. Yeah, best comment of the day right there. So yeah, this is an excellent paper, but like I'm not given a. But like, see, and there's a reason it's published in a good journal because look, like I said, everything was laid out well. I feel like you're more of the student here. I'm still in your undergrad. That's fine. And actually, this is a good paper to look at if you are a student because this is the sort of thing that I think Aristotle went and looked up this author. They're well published very quickly. If you can sort of look at this paper as a model of how to write philosophy papers, that this is also scores high on how to teach people how to write philosophy papers sort of scores. So if like you want to look at what did this person do here, let's go back to the start. They set out a 4-line argument, 1, 2, 3, and then a conclusion. 4-line argument. No, I wouldn't go tenurable. No one's tenurable because there are no tenure jobs. So that's an impossibility, Aristotle. So they set out a 4-line argument. Then they went and they argued. Then they basically went back, and then the rest of the paper was them arguing against 1, 2, or 3. That their opponent can argue. They were arguing for this or against their opponent in terms of these 3 things to show that the conclusion that they want to get is what they wanted. And they did this in various ways. They had some nice examples. They used some good examples from the literature. They also threw in a little bit of logic right here, even though that was sort of pointless in mine and Aristotle's opinion. They showed that they could do the logic here. Then they went down and they talked about some of the history of emotivism, and then they showed it in terms of the history, in terms of emotivism. And then in the next section, then they went down. They talked about contemporary Blackburn, and then they also talked about and then they gave a definition of exactly on what side the people would fall down on. And this veritistic error such that all claims within a domain are false or are subject to false presupposition. And you see what they did right here. Let me just highlight this. Error such that all claims within a domain are false or are subject to some presupposition. All claims within a domain. They don't specify morality here. And this is the spot where they're giving it away, because they're not arguing within morality. And is this a claim of morality within the domain of morality? They're claiming something else. This is a metaphysical claim. Aristotle, forthcoming in ethics, 2021 mind, 2021 ratio, 2020 ethical theory, moral practice, 2018 philosophical mathematica. If this kid got a book out in a couple of papers, he would be on par with R1 professors who are associate. Yep, that's fair. In terms of output, that's right. They're doing very well. But this is what right here is what gets me, is that you can see their bias. They're not talking about morality here. All claims within a domain. And so it's a metaphysical claim trying to come down and have a ethical conclusion or a moral conclusion. And that's very hard to pull off correctly. And so that's kind of where we disagree. But like I said, and then what was this? They had this sort of big claim right here that they can just point to, and then they discussed it in terms of one last big name here for the group, Railton. And so that gives another juicy thing to bite into. So this is a really well done paper in terms of what people want to see. So good paper. Anybody, you guys have any questions about this? Can poke more fun at things, and we can compliment folks again. Let's see, anything to look at in the acknowledgments. Let's see, nothing here. No, okay, nothing interesting there. Let's see, anything, blah 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 blah. Footnotes. Okay. I think we said most of what we wanted to say. Again, this is the argument style in the end is coming down from on theory to give us conclusions. And that's very hard in an area like ethics. I mean, if you're going to do that in logic, that's one thing. You'd be like, hey, look, we got a contradiction. If you don't like contradictions, you got a problem. Here, again, we're like, oh, we got a contradiction. It's like, well, did we really? Like, I don't know. Like, what's an ethical contradiction in this case? Because a logical contradiction doesn't necessarily have ethical consequences or moral consequences. So, yeah. But this is all the same stuff. But yeah, I think that's it for now. I'm going to try to get back to broadcasting. If Cinesemiotics, you're here at all, I'm sorry I didn't read your paper. I didn't know if you were still here, but I have your paper going. I mean, I could take a little break and maybe come back. I'm not sure, but I'm a little bit, I'm just really happy with how this went. I'm happy with folks showing up, chatting, and so it's like I want to like run away before anything goes wrong. So let me know. Thank you, Aristotle, for being here. Partiarity, Cinesemiotics. We had some other people stop by. Brandy B. Haas followed me right at the beginning. I don't know if I mentioned that, but thank you, Haas. So yeah, thanks. And have a good night, everybody. Yeah, I'm gone. Brandy B, I'd see another episode. I have no idea what's going on, but I watched this to seem smart. Brandy, I thank you for being here. Ask questions, you know? It's like, we're just talking about stuff. And that's all I do. It's like, I come here and I try to see what other people have. Like, the idea here, Brandy, is just, I'm trying to see if, like, what people think they have good ideas about. Like, is this really a good idea, or are we just talking out of our butt? Most of the time we're talking out of our butt. But you know what? Like, sometimes people have good ideas, stuff to talk about, something to think about. Have a great night, everybody, and stay safe out there. It's kind of messy. Bye-bye.